Today I'm here with Rhiannon Beaubien, and we're talking about her mental models course that she's done with Shane Parrish on the Farnam Street blog. Rhiannon is the managing editor or managing director of Farnam Street blog and lead author on the Great Mental Models book series, and also part of this mental models course that just came out. So we're going to be talking about mental models today, decision making. And so, Rhiannon, thanks for coming on and welcome.
Thank you.
So, I want to start off because people are often kind of confused about what mental models are and what's the point of it. And I always bring it back to the quality decision making, but how do you think about it?
So mental models they're the way we think anyway, right? I mean, you can't relearn everything every day. It would be exhausting. So you store information and you chunk it, and you look for patterns and you chunk it so that when you go out in the world, you can easily make sense of things that are familiar and focus on the things that are unfamiliar. So mental models are something we do naturally. But I always say that because there's something we do naturally and they are the lens with which we look through everything, we owe it to ourselves to have the best mental models possible. And the reality is, most of us don't. Most of us learn things in school that we carry with us through the years. We kind of have to remember there's a lot of assumptions and biases. We don't upgrade our thinking, we specialize. And so we lose track of what's happening in other disciplines and other fields. And so the mental models that we are going to take out into the world anyway become stale, inaccurate, ineffective. And so what we try to do at Farnam Street is talk about deliberately constructed mental models, which is you're going to use them anyway. So go out and construct some right from scratch, build them up with a full understanding so they're not going to lead you astray, and then use those to navigate your world, including making decisions.
Mhm. Can you talk about how mental models, this and the lattice work concept, where it started and kind of where you've taken it since then?
So it's completely and totally inspired by Charlie Munger, who talks about having not only having worldly wisdom, but having a set of models that you can use and then hanging those models in a lattice work.
Hmm.
So Shane has been inspired by that for decades, and me a little bit less, but going on a decade now.
Hmm.
And the idea is that there's a lot of really valuable knowledge out there in the world. So go find some of it, go learn some of it. But the lattice work concept comes in is that if you try to learn things, and I think we can all understand this pretty easily, if you try to learn things in isolation, they don't stick. They don't stay in your memory. You can't recall that knowledge when you need it. So the lattice work is the idea that you put your knowledge into some sort of structure and you use that structure to help you recall and use information that's appropriate for when you need it.
Hmm. So I think that's a good segue actually into the difference between the Great Mental Models book series and the course. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, sure. The Great Mental Models book series, we looked for, okay, so before I get into that, I want to say
Yeah.
there are lots and lots and lots of mental models in the world. And there's lots of amazing ones. And
Hmm.
I'm never going to tell you, like, oh, mine are better than yours. I think mine are great, but other people may have wonderful ones that suit them. But what Farnam Street did is we came up with a list of what we consider core models from core disciplines. So things that are never going to go out of fashion: physics, chemistry, biology, mathematics, systems. These things are standard. We feel they're going to be around for a long time, and we feel that the core ideas that make up those disciplines are pretty foundational. They may change and evolve slightly, but the basics of them isn't going to change.
Hmm.
So we created this list of mental models. What we did with the books is we couldn't do it all in one book, so we're doing it over 4 books. We take models, we organize them by discipline, and we dive into what that actually means as a model and how you might be able to use it as a model by looking at a historical situation. So we describe the concept like thermodynamics. You get a brief introduction of what thermodynamics is, but then you get 2 scenarios. And the way I always think about mental models in terms of using them, like a lattice work, deliberately constructed ones, is that I almost have this like aperture that can have different lenses, and each model is a lens And so I'll take out the model of thermodynamics, the lens of thermodynamics, I'll pop it into my aperture and I will look at a situation, either in my life or in an article, in a book, and I'll say, what can I learn looking through this lens? What can I see differently that maybe I didn't see if I wasn't using this lens? And so that's what the book tries to do. It's not about cause and effect. For thermodynamics in particular, we talk about like famous walls in history, Berlin Wall, Great Wall of China, Hadrian's Wall, and how they operated and why some of them were more successful than others. That is not to say that thermodynamics offers a causal explanation of why the Berlin Wall fell. That is not what we're after. What we're saying, if you look at this situation through the lens of thermodynamics, what might you learn? What might you learn that you could then go and apply to your life? So the books are an introduction to the models and the various ways they could be useful to you. In every situation we describe, there are pretty clear and easily transferable elements to everyday situations that people face and everyday challenges that they face. But then the course was, okay, so you've learned all these models. Now, how do you use them? How do you integrate them into your thinking process so that in the heat of the moment, in a situation of conflict, when the stakes are really high, they're available to you. You don't just rely on, bias, gut instinct, bad information, your emotions, but that all these things that you've learned, these models that you've learned are available to you to use to make better decisions. And so that's kind of the difference between the books and the course.
So you said there's 4 books in the series, but the first book is kind of a general concepts, right? So how does the first book differentiate from the other ones?
It doesn't in terms of structure. So it's the same thing. You get an explanation of the concept and then, 1 to 3 historical situations where we look at that through the lens of the concept. It's just those 9 general thinking concepts didn't fit clearly into a specific subject. And we decided to organize the rest of the books by subject. And these are the ones that, and to be honest, the first 9 are they're heavy hitters. Like if you want to start somewhere, those first 9 are great to start with.
Is it okay if I just read them out? Because I have the table of contents.
Yeah, for sure.
So map is not the territory, circle of competence, falsifiability. I think that's a supporting one. First principles thinking, thought experiment, necessity and sufficiency, second order thinking, probabilistic thinking, causation versus correlation, inversion, Occam's razor, Hanlon's razor. Hanlon's razor, the last one. So those are kind of the general thinking mental models, and then the other ones go into like volume 2 is physics, chemistry, biology, volume 3 is systems and mathematics. So what's the next one that's coming?
Economics and art.
Economics and art.
Yeah.
So can you give us like an example of how a mental model from art would be used in like another, because that's one of the things that I really like about your approach is that you really emphasize not being too specialized, the interconnection of things being cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary. So could you give an example from like, because I'm just curious about like the art one, like what's an example from there used in another field, and then we can get to the kind of interdisciplinarity thing.
Sure. So, keep in mind that this is still in progress, but the models themselves have been set. So a couple of big models that come up in art, like for example, audience. Okay. It's pretty hard to imagine art without an audience. I feel like every artist who ever creates, even if the audience is just themselves, they are looking to have an audience for their art. So what does that mean? How do you, if you think, okay, so art requires an audience, what do audiences do? Right? Well, one of the things audiences do is they may change what gets created, right? Depending on who your audience is. Another big one from art that's related to that is performance. We perform art in a lot of senses, right? We perform music, we perform theater, movies are performed. So what role does performance have, and how does that, like, performance is actors, but it's also, like, let's say in theater, but it's also setting. So where you perform, so setting is another model. Where you're doing your art can have huge impact on the kind of art that you do, and throughout history, that's absolutely been the case. So those are the models that we're looking at. We're looking at ones that definitely apply to more than one art.
Mm-hmm.
Like any of our books, it's not exhaustive. It's not all the models in arts. It's
Mm-hmm.
our, top 10. These we think are really versatile.
Mm-hmm.
And then finding situations in which they might apply. So for performance, I mean, this is like a bit of a teaser. Let's call it a teaser. But I'm looking at the idea of, there's a lot of really interesting stories. So I'm a huge history buff, which I think is good considering the kind of books you write. And one of the periods of history I've always been interested in is the Cold War. And, there's a lot of different ideas about what started to make that Cold War collapse. But if you look, there's a lot of articles online, even in quite a few books, about the role of Pope John Paul II and the performances that he gave and how they turned the tide in some sense in terms of public sentiment, especially in Poland. I mean, he was the first non-Italian pope in like 500 years or something. Do you think it was an accident that he was from an Eastern Bloc country? I don't know. You know what I mean? And so, how did his performance affect the end of the Cold War? And now, again, it's not causation. I'm not saying his performance was the single reason that the Cold War was over, but it's pretty interesting when you look at it through that lens and you think of that as a model now, right? In your own life, when you go to a meeting, when you're giving a presentation, what I'm doing right now, these are effectively performances. And if you think about the dynamics that make a good performance, that can impact a performance, well, now you have an interesting way of thinking about some of the micro performances you're going to do, and you have to do every day. So
Um, history is actually a really interesting example of interdisciplinarity because it does have like there's many different theories of history, and some theories posit kind of different aspects of causality or kind of non-causality. So you have different ways of framing things, and I think a lot of other specialties don't have that as much. Can you talk about that a little bit? Like the different, like people who aren't history buffs or didn't study history, they tend to not even realize that there's different theories of history.
it's fascinating. And I mean, I have a list of quotes that I kind of once in a while put on Twitter
Yeah.
about different historians talking about how to do history, because like I don't think there's a whole lot of consensus in the field either, to be quite honest. But I like the ones that are completely and totally upfront about how history is like that is a huge topic. I mean, the fact that we even put it into one bucket and call it history is amazing, right? It depends on your perspective. It depends on your education. It depends on what you're looking for. It depends on, there's a huge amount of survivorship bias in history, right? Like what survived? Well, the records that we're working with are the ones that survived. Are those the only records that ever existed? Absolutely not.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that history is a great, I'm not in super big into looking in for cause and effect in history. Like I think it's more interesting to look at patterns and trends. I'm reading a great book today, The Silk Roads. And it's like, eye-opening, right? Just the same history, just from a different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And what can that teach us and what can that show us? And I'm never, I'm always amazed by how many things I think are unique to today.
Mm-hmm.
And then you read some history, like, wow, humans have been doing that for a long time. So I think I think that it's a great way to start using mental models, actually, to bring this around to what we're here to talk about, is that there's so much nuance in history. And sometimes when you start using mental models, it can be a lot of pressure to just start applying them in your life. In high stakes situations or situations of conflict, it's a little bit difficult. So history is a nice way to break into using mental models because it gives you that little bit of space to say, okay, I'm not invested in this anymore. This happened 500 years ago. So I'm going to pull up my model and I'm going to see what I can learn today.
Mm-hmm. So what about interdisciplinarity in general? Like how does I mean, just how do you think about it, or how do you value it? How do you think about, the education system that we have that really emphasizes a specialization and professionalization as opposed to frameworks that really emphasize having a broad range of skills and knowledge in mental models?
Yeah, like this is really tough, right? Because I'm obviously a big fan of the interdisciplinary. I mean, I think that, even in a team, you think of really successful teams, most of them have people from different backgrounds.
Yeah.
So they're bringing different perspectives to bear on any situation that team is facing. I notice anecdotally, like my kids definitely enjoy the interdisciplinary projects, right? Like my son recently did one that combined math, history, and art. And that was about constellations. And I mean, he loved it. It made sense to him. It was a concrete thing that he could get his head around. But that said, sometimes I wonder too, and again, I'm not an expert in this field in education, like full stop, but I noticed that, schools are under a lot of pressure to deliver bodies for the marketplace. So is this a reflection of what businesses want? I mean, when you look at the job adverts, is it, hey, we want somebody with a lot of general knowledge who's really interesting in a wide variety of skill sets to come and join our team, or we're looking for somebody with 10 years experience coding Java? I don't know. So I think that there's like, the education system doesn't work in a vacuum, right? So like, what is it that we're asking of it, and what kind of people is it meant to produce, and what roles are they meant to fulfill?
Yeah, we were talking about on before the call, the program you did with kids on learning mental models. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
So when I first started learning mental models, one of a model, and one really important aspect of learning mental models, well, learning anything really, is feedback, right? So you in order to get better, you need to get feedback, because you need to iterate. You need to make small changes in order to try again and see if you're any better this time around. So when I first started learning models, I would practice on my kids because they are great for honest feedback, and I live with them every day. They change all the time. So there's lots of opportunities to iterate. And so one of the things that grew out of that was our Rethink Parenting course, which talks about mental models in parenting. And the models that you can use, I mean, you can use any model in parenting, but we focused on 6, I'd say the top 6 models if you want to change up your parenting. And it's incredibly valuable because I find that situations that you're in every day, there's you can get into bad habits really quick. And sometimes it's hard to shake out of those habits. So one of the great things that mental models can do in daily is just improve your daily interactions. So it doesn't always have to be like, the big decision. It can just be a series of small decisions that improve because now you have these tools. And so that's how we look at it in the home. It's not about only teaching the kids models. It's about you learning them too, and you learning that language together. I also, personally, I teach my kids models. They are familiar with, the older ones familiar with probably a dozen, and the younger ones, I think, working on 4. Okay. But they get them. And I can't stress that enough to people. Like, there's nothing complicated about mental models. This is not magic. It's not esoteric. Like, it is just very functional, useful knowledge. And my kids love it because it gives us a common language, and it's a tool. It's a usable tool for them. It's not just something they have to learn and keep in their brain and it just sits there. It's an actual tool.
Can you give an example of like a mental model you've taught them and then how they've gone out and used it or brought it up in kind of a fun
situation? Sure. Yeah. My go-to mental model, me personally, I use it all the time, but also for younger people or people who are new to mental models, is Inversion, because it's really, really simple. You just, instead of starting where you are, you start at the end and work backwards. Mm-hmm. So I've taught this one to both my kids. This is the first one I taught them. So my older son had a project presentation due last year, and it didn't go so well. And I was like, okay, didn't go so well. That's okay. You're allowed, you're still learning, but how do we get better? How do we make it go better next time? And he's like, well, I don't know what I did wrong. And I was like, okay, well, this is an opportunity to practice our model of inversion. So let's imagine your next presentation goes really well. You get a really good mark. what else had to happen?
Yeah.
Well, your teacher liked it, your peers liked it, you met the requirements of the rubric. Well, how did you meet those requirements? Well, first of all, you knew about them ahead of time. And so we work backwards to, I needed supplies to make a poster, and I told my mom more than 24 hours before the project was due. So it helped him make a plan. And so this year, like, he's rocking the presentations, right? Because every time he gets that assignment, he starts at the end and he says, okay, this is what I want to do. This is my successful presentation. And then he works backwards to identify, okay, he's 11. It's not necessarily all the steps that an adult would do, but he works backward to identify his time management, right? How many hours can he spend on it a day? How many hours does he think it's going to take? So when does he need to start?
Yeah.
And we work backwards. So that's just a very simple model. I use it personally too all the time. And my kids, they get it. They want this dream to become a reality. It's not going to become a reality on its own. You have to make that happen. So start with your dream and work backward and identify all the elements that need to occur.
And I think kind of combining inversion and history, planning is sort of the inversion of history. And when you're planning, you're kind of taking the perspective of you standing at the finish line and then looking backwards and saying, hey, how did I get here? And so there's you're kind of planning is actually kind of like writing a history in terms of what would be the ideal history of how I would pass these different checkpoints. And so I've found that my interest in history really emerged when I started looking at long-term planning. And I think for kids and also just for people in general, and Ray Dalio has been big into this. He did his principles book, but then more recently he's looking at the rise and fall of civilizations. And he said something really interesting about how all the times that he went back into his investing history and he looked at when was I surprised? When did I make a mistake? And it was always something that happened on a time scale that was bigger than he had ever lived, like than the length of a human life. So it's something that only happened every 100 years or 250 years or whatever. And so, though, and I don't know if he talked about the Soviet Union specifically, but like that's an example of most experts did not predict that, and they didn't understand, I guess, the economic components of it. And so even experts aren't necessarily looking at the right time scale and then using that to look forward. And so I think with kids especially, the skill of planning, and I've seen research that a significant amount of professional success just has to do with just being able to manage your time and make long-term plans. And people that tend to be the most successful professionally also tend to have multi-year plans stepped out. And even beyond that, their parents have plans for them or potential plans. And so when they're in elementary school, they've already got a vision of, hey, my kid's going to go to this school or that school, or maybe they'll become a surgeon or a lawyer or something else, programmer. And so I'm going to get them into that kid's programming class when they're in kindergarten or first grade, or send them to a certain summer camp. And so that parent is doing 10, 20, 50-year plans for their child and helping them kind of scaffold that. So I was wondering if that brought up any ideas or concepts for you or mental models.
Well, for sure. Just the idea of like that, to me, that ties in a lot to what we would use a model of second order thinking for, right? Which is that sometimes you need to go through short-term pain for long-term gain. And if you don't have a plan, if you don't know the long-term gain you're working towards, you're more likely to give up or not accept the short-term pain, right? Because if you don't understand why you're going through the short-term pain, you're gonna be like, well, this is painful. I don't do painful. I'm out of here. But if you can say to yourself, well, okay, this is really awkward, but my plan is to get here, then I know I can suck it up and I can get through this, because this is one step on that path.
Mhm.
I mean, even in terms of planning, like, it's like, to me, this is also like basic financial planning. Like, regardless of maybe what you want your child to do, if you want them to go to school post high school, even for high school, depending on where you live, that costs money, and they're not going to be able to go unless the money's available. So what decisions you make now can really have an impact on what their options are in the future. But if you don't get to, we all only have a certain amount of disposable income. And so if you don't get to spend that on X, whatever, if you didn't have that long-term plan, you might resent it, or you might give up the savings. But you're like, no, 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 we're not, let's say we're not going on this vacation this year, because that money has to go into an account so that our child can go to university in 15 years.
Yeah.
Right. So that it just helps with that kind of stuff. And so that's what second order thinking is. Like, that's the model second order thinking that, we use a lot, is like, where am I trying to get to? Velocity is another one, is the idea that, we can move really fast in life, but do we get anywhere? So it's like, having a direction is really important. Otherwise, it's really easy to get busy. It's really easy to waste your time.
So, are there any bad mental models that you've found people use that kind of hinder their decision making? Kind of looking at the other side of the coin.
Um, no, I think it's the way people use them that's bad.
Okay.
So, I mean, unless like you have a model that's wrong, like, there's some things I'm willing to stand behind. Like, I think if you have a model of flat Earth, maybe you're not going to make good decisions, and I'm fully capable of committing to the side of saying the Earth is not flat.
Yeah.
But aside from those more extreme cases, what I see more often is two things. Is one, people don't take the time to learn them really well. So they stop at a soundbite or a 2-sentence description from somebody else, and then they go to apply it, and then it doesn't work, and it doesn't give them valuable insight. And it's like, well, you don't actually know what you're applying. You've never, you don't have any skin in the game on that one. The other is that people just use too few models. So what I see also happen a lot is people they'll get on the bandwagon and they'll learn like 2 or 3, which is a great start,
Mm-hmm.
but they'll stop. And so they'll just keep using those 2 or 3 models. And that's when you get into the quote, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right. So you're overusing them. And I'm not saying there's any set amount. It's not like you have to have 500 or something. You have to have, an amount that's manageable. But at the same time, you want to have different disciplines. You want to have some models that may conflict with each other. That's really good to have, right? Otherwise you're just kind of telling yourself what you want to hear all the time. The whole point of really good, deliberately constructed mental models is to challenge and investigate your thinking.
Yeah. Could you talk about like how you did your research on the books to really study these models in depth, and then what you came away with the final result?
Sure. So for the topic-based ones, so some subjects I had, let's say, some familiarity in, as in I'd taken courses or something, and others I literally had no real knowledge of.
Mm-hmm.
So when I start a book, like when we start them, there's very few words that are on the page at the beginning, because there's just a ton of learning.
Mm-hmm.
So I just read and read and read and read, and I make tons of notes. But the thing is I'm reading with a purpose, because I have a general idea of the models that are going to be included. Now, the list does change, as you learn more. You're like, oh, we missed that model, and that's a great one. And other times there are good models, but they don't necessarily make great book chapters. So like we'll have those in the book somewhere, but they may not get a full chapter devoted to them. So there's a little bit of give and take, but really it's just about a lot of reading. And then I distill all that reading and all those notes into, 2 to 3 pages of, this is what I think, not what I think the topic is, but what it is as a model, right? Because I mean, if you're going to learn about velocity, like, you can go do that on like physics101.com. Like, I'm not here to teach you what velocity is.
Right.
I'm here to teach you something about velocity so that you can use that something to build a model. And this is how I think you could build a model with the information I'm giving you. So, and then we vet that. So, there's like any of these books, any nonfiction books, it takes a village. So there's experts in the fields that we're writing about who very generously donate their time and, read the first draft. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of examples that end up in the graveyard, that just, they don't resonate, they don't click, they're maybe not the best way to describe the idea, or we found a better one later. So it's a lot of give and take, and there's a lot of, and then not everybody agrees, right? I mean, there's no such thing as a consensus on anything. So some people will like an example, some people won't. How do we make it better? How do we strengthen it? But that's what it is. It's just reading. It's like a funnel, right? So it's just like reading as much as you can. And then after a while with some of these concepts, it tends to become repetitive. You're like, okay, I've got it now. I've covered this before. And then it's drilling it down and down and down and down and down until you get sort of 2 to 3 sentences of this is the model. When I go to pull out this model, this is what I'm using to trigger all this information in my brain.
So could you talk more about like the overall decision-making process? Because that seems to, like, that's how I think about it, is that all this stuff is about improving the decision-making process. So like, how do you model that? And how do mental models fit into that?
They fit in at a few different points, okay, right? So it's important to remember that. So I can talk about a few of those. I mean, yep. One of the really useful moments to use a mental model is when you're information gathering. So before you're making any sort of substantive decision, you're usually gathering some information, right? Mm-hmm. Mental models are great for making sure you're getting a cross-section of information. They're also good for filtering out what may be valuable. So one of the most important ones, like, let's say you're in a situation at work and, there's a disagreement on the team about the way to develop a product. Mm-hmm. So before you jump in with this is what I think we should do, it's like, okay, like, let's walk around this problem and get as many perspectives as we can. What is this person thinking? And not passing any judgment, just saying, okay, let's get an idea of what everybody's thinking, why they're thinking it, what are the challenges are, what perspectives are they bringing to bear? And then moving forward, how do you talk to people? How do you get the win-win? You use reciprocity. You say, okay, like, how can I really support what's going on here while still getting us towards a goal? Velocity again, there's your direction. Where are we moving? There's another one I love from math, like global and local maxima. Like, sometimes you have to go down to go back up. Like, do we need to take a hit? Do we need to, because we're developing a whole new product line, in your personal life, do I need to take a bit of a salary cut to move up a new ladder to achieve something else? So when you're gathering information in order to make a decision, that's when mental models can be useful, because you just pull them out one at a time, lens after lens after lens. Bigger the decision, I find, the more models I use, right? Small decisions, 3 or 4, I've used them often enough that I can kind of focus in on the 3 that would be best, and then I pick a random one to just check in. Mm-hmm. Big decisions, now I'm using 10, 15. So that's a really good time to use models. It's also, models are really good for stress testing. Oh, I'll go in order. So the next thing they're useful for is making a plan, right? So inversion is a great one for that. Second order thinking, circle of competence. Like, we all have these ideas about things we can do, but do we actually have the skills, the tools, the resources to do them? So when you're making your plan of action, you can use different mental models to look at your options, your opportunities, what's required. And then they're also great for stress testing. So, that idea of, like, a lot of people talk about pre-mortems. It's like, that idea of stress testing something before it goes out the door. If this is going to fail, how does it fail? What are the points of failure? What models can we bring to bear and look at this situation to say, okay, what are some of the points of failure that could happen?
I get the sense that, like, I like that you put it in a group context, because when you're thinking by yourself and you're trying to make a decision by yourself, if you're not going to do it in a group, you need to try to get other opinions in there in one way or another and kind of get yourself to take different perspectives and then put them together and see what happens, and being open to seeing what happens. And so I like the term red teaming, because it's like you're creating an opponent, you're kind of doing the debate in your head, and you're trying. And I did debate when I was in school. So what would happen is the judge would flip a coin right before the debate, and you'd find out which side of the debate you were gonna argue for. And so you had to prepare just as well on either side of something, and really develop arguments, and then also look at the argument and see what's the counter argument to that. And it goes back and forth. So, and I find unless you've had an experience like that or had a practice like that, you tend to not spend the time to look at different perspectives and really evaluate them. So a group is a good way to do that, or having a coach, or having somebody who you can talk to who can take a different perspective and you can talk about it back and forth. And I find that mental models give you a good way to encapsulate a different perspective or a tool for looking at something, so that if that person who embodies that mental model isn't there in front of you or in the conference room with you, you can still use that and have easy access. Because so much of our memory is about it's not just about having it there, but it's about if you can access it. And so I feel like these mental models and what you've done with the course and the books is give people a very easy way to start installing these things in their head, so that when you're in that moment of decision making or in one of these steps of the process, it's much easier for you to reach for that other perspective or that other lens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Could you talk about, like, when you're making a decision on your own, how this kind of stuff helps when it's not in a group situation?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I don't think we ever make decisions super in isolation. Very few of us. Most of us have, family considerations or friendships, geographical considerations. But if I'm purely like, this is me, I still put it through the stress test of mental models. So, for instance, like writing. So, writing is at the beginning, before you start soliciting comments, it's a fairly solitary pursuit. But I use mental models all the time. I'll use so in my personal life, I write fiction for fun.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes you're staring at that blank page and, you've just written this great scene and you're like, I don't know what the next scene is, So it's like, okay, I go back, I use inversion. Okay, where am I trying to end up? Right? What is a great scene in order for me to get there? Second order thinking. If I make my characters do this, and then what's going to happen? What doors am I closing? What doors am I opening for the plot, for the characters? If I am just starting a brand new book,
Mm-hmm.
it's randomness sometimes. Sometimes you're just like, I've got a million ideas. I have more ideas than I can ever write. So let's randomly pick one and just do 10,000 words and see how far we get. Because 10,000 words for me you need at least 10,000 words to know if you have a plot. So that's what I do. I do like a 10,000 word thing. So those are ways I sort of use them just for me, personally, on sort of things that I'm working on in my life. But even at home, even let's say personal decisions, like career change or something, I'm married, so I'm not going to unilaterally make a decision that's big like that, especially if it's going to affect our household income or something like that. I mean, I have to engage my husband and say, okay, let's talk about this. So how you do it is different in that situation than you would at work, let's say, but it's still an example of, what models can I bring to bear? And so the other thing I like to do too is if I'm going to try to convince somebody of something, I run my argument through mental models, because then I can anticipate a wider variety of challenges that are going to come up. So that's another way I'll use them myself before I take them out into the world, or take my argument out into the world,
Could you give an example of that?
Well, so one example was, so before I worked for Farnam Street, I worked for the Canadian federal government, and I was done. I just hit this point where I was done,
Mhm.
and I knew I wanted to leave and I wanted to do something different. So, you know, just walking home and announcing like, hey, I'm going to quit my job and do something different is, like I could do that. I mean, my husband would, he wouldn't fall over and die or anything, but it was like, is that how I want to start the conversation and have nothing else to say about it? Because he'd be like, oh, well, what do you want to do? And why do you want to do it? Like you anticipate the question. So then I was like, okay, I came up with like 3 different plans for options. And I kind of use mental models to invert. Like I inverted, okay, what is my dream job like, working backwards? What changes do I have to make in my lifestyle now in order to get to that dream job? What kind of industries have that job? Where are the opportunities? Are they here in Ottawa? Or are they somewhere else? So I did a lot of research on my own
Mhm.
and came up with plans, and then would use models to stress test those plans. So by the time I talked to my husband, like he was on board within an hour, like it wasn't like a scary, like, oh my God, what is my wife doing today? It's, oh, hey, there's some really cool ideas here. And how can I help you? So like the buy-in came right away. It's like, how can I help you reach these goals versus you're scaring the crap out of me because you haven't thought this through. Right.
Yeah. Um, and I wanted to ask you a little bit more about fiction because this is something I also kind of uh, like what you said earlier about history. The victor writes the history, or who's writing the history, and who are they writing about? So there's a fictional aspect just in the sense of reducing things down to something that's manageable. And so in a sense, writing history, there's a fictional component of it, or at least you're kind of either explicitly or implicitly drawing some kind of connections of causation or some kind of process that's happening. And so with planning, it's also this is kind of where it really struck a chord with me is planning is fiction writing because you are thinking about the future. You are looking into the future and trying to come up with something that at least seems plausible, seems realistic, smart goals and stuff like that. Um, but there's also a didactic component to writing fiction and sort of teaching. Um, and a lot of kids' stories are like that. So I guess I was curious just how you thought about fiction writing. If you like, you're writing novels, right? So I saw your novel. I didn't really look into it, but can you talk about like how if you see fiction writing as similar to planning and and like what are the key mental models maybe like I find people when they think about writing something that's book length, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, it's like, well, what's the framework, what's the overarching structure, and that's such a big component of it. So I'm curious if you just have any thoughts on that and kind of like what's your overall framework that you use when you're sitting down and plotting something out, or just you've got an idea but you're thinking like, how do I turn that into a novel?
So planning is incredibly essential. I think there's writers, I've read a whole bunch of different ways of doing it. Some writers will literally plot out, 70 pages of plot points and then fill it in. I don't write that way. I write kind of more in the signpost way, which is where I have a plan as in I know where I'm going, but I like to be surprised by my characters often as I'm writing. So I leave room for them to, present options to me that maybe I hadn't thought of. But I will say that the really fascinating thing about writing fiction, which I think is a great foundation for a lot of things, is it teaches you that every decision you make has a consequence, right? You can't make decisions in a vacuum and expect nothing to happen. So when you like, from the moment you sit down and you type that first sentence, you have to make a decision about setting. You have to make a decision about where your book is set. It has to be somewhere. It can be in the future. It can be in a place you make up. It can be in a historical context. It can be your room, but it has to be somewhere. And once you make that decision, there's a whole series of consequences that flow from that. There's a whole series of decisions that have then been made for you, right? Like, so my book is set in 1975. There's no internet. There are no cell phones. So the whole plot then has to be constructed without that technology available. And that changes how your plot unfolds,
Mhm.
right? It changes the time that actions are going to take. So it changes what your characters can do. So
What is
I
your book
think
about?
that,
Just could you give like a quick summary of what it's about?
oh, sure. It's a novel set in Cold War Berlin,
Okay.
1975. So before, when I was working in the government, I worked in security and intelligence. I worked for an intelligence agency, and I loved it. I learned a lot, and I'd written quite a few things. But then it's like, right, what you know? I'm like, I don't know anything interesting. But wait, I know this entire field of spying that not everybody knows about, and I was super interested in it for many years. So I decided to write a spy novel. So the kind of intelligence I worked in. So there's two main types. Maybe getting a little bit detailed, but there's two main types of intelligence. There's human intelligence, which is what your CIA would do, and then there's signals intelligence, which is what your NSA would do. And I worked in signals intelligence.
Okay.
And they're not the same. They have nothing to do with each other sometimes. They don't attract the same type of people. And I had so many great, I wouldn't say stories in terms of details, but stories in terms of interactions between those two types of intelligence that I knew I wanted to write a book that explored that had some signals people and had some human intelligence people, and just show how complex and how different this intelligence world is. And then I chose 1975 because I once you work in an agency like this, you're what they call like permanently bound to secrecy. You can't ever talk about it for the rest of your life. And 1975 was before the modern technology. So there was no danger of inadvertent classified knowledge slipping in, right? So that's why I chose 1975. And I thought still think the idea of a divided Berlin is one of the most interesting moments of history. And so it's about a signals intelligence officer who's there on a deployed mission, and one of her couriers goes missing. And in order to help out her courier, she develops a very uneasy relationship with this guy in the CIA who has his own agenda. And it's their story of how, well, it's really her story of how she navigates this incredibly complex world as an electronics engineer.
So
So,
she's in the Canadian NSA and he's in the CIA,
yeah,
and they're both in Berlin on the
yeah,
western side,
yes,
and they have to like work together.
yes.
Okay.
But not in an officially sanctioned way,
Oh,
because
like back channel.
this is off the books. Like he has a an operation that he's doing that she could be of some use for, but what she's doing is trying to help out a courier that has just completely fallen off the rails. So it's there's a tension there,
It sounds almost like a 007 type of plot in a way, because they're
and
kind
you know
of
what, and
using
I'm
each
okay with
other.
that, because
Yeah.
I wanted to, like, and again, these are choices you make when you go to write. Like, who is your audience? What kind of experience do you want them to have? I wanted to write something smart and fun. This is not meant to solve all the world's problems. This is to be like I want people to be entertained and engaged by my characters in my story.
So there's a romance side to it, and there's kind of the intelligence side of it, and the historical side of it.
Yeah, I wouldn't say there's too much of a romance.
There's
I'm
okay.
not a great romance writer. But I will say that they develop an understanding and an affection for each other because of what they go through. But there's other really great characters too. I mean, there's this fantastic character from the British military, this Scottish guy who helps out, and he's wonderful.
Is that like his
Um,
MI6 type thing?
no, he's not. He's full on uniform. He's
Oh
in
well, okay.
psychological operations. He works at Radio Free Berlin, and he's on the radio every day. And so the romance is. I would even say there's a romance, and it's not
Okay.
the focus because I'm not. I'm not really great at those.
Okay. I thought it was interesting, kind of the signals versus the human, because that's kind of like the two sides of the brain. And you have mental models, which is the kind of more logical side, and then you have the intuition, which is maybe more of the human side and the humanities. So, mental models tends to, I don't know, this is uh, almost getting into epistemology, but in the humanities, there's it's not as empirical necessarily, and you're not
Mhm.
using data in the same way. So how do you, but there's still mental models and there's still a lot of intellectual content in the humanities, and to a certain extent that's gone into psychology and social sciences and stuff like that. So sometimes I think like these are kind of orthogonal. You have kind of the intuitive emotional side of the brain and then the logical thinking side, but then you also, and so the non-verbal side, does it not use mental models, or does it only use like visual or audible models? So there's that distinction between sort of language and non-language, and then there's sort of mathematical models, which would be the signal side, and then there's kind of symbolic models that are in the human side. So what do you think about those two different like dimensions?
Well, I think when it comes to the kind of mental models that we talk about in practice at Farnam Street, it's a really nice blend between the two. So
Okay.
you need your intellectual side to create them and to invest in them and do the learning that uses them. But we're not talking about, like I said before, and actually we say in every single book to remind people, we're not talking about literal cause and effect. Just because you use velocity as a model, you're not saying this is an example of velocity. Like in the book, we talk about Napoleon's March on Moscow. It's not a textbook physics textbook example of velocity, and I think that's where the other side of the brain comes in, is understanding that a lot of these times you're using a model more as a metaphor or an analogy, and there's nothing wrong with that. And that's the fun of it. That's the exciting part, is being able to take this knowledge that you learned for one thing and stretch your brain and be creative and be curious and see where else this knowledge can help you. So I think it's actually kind of a nice balance between the two.
And I think that the work you've done on like finding examples is really important, because you can get into thinking that, oh, it's just about knowing the definition of each model and then you can just use it. But really, before any of that, before you really get traction, you need to have enough examples where you can be out in the world and recognize, hey, this is similar to that other thing. And that tends to not, that's just not how the brain works if you've never done that practice. So, like, you can intellectually study a little bit of a language, but until you actually do a lot of those exercises and practice translating and practice hearing the word and then translating, it eventually becomes automatic. Without doing those exercises and those that practice, you're not going to be able to in the moment say, "Oh, I can apply this model to that situation." So like when you talked about Napoleon's March or these other historical examples, I kind of connect this to the concept of case-based reasoning, which is used in AI, and it's also used in just like doctors looking at different cases and try, like the House TV show, like trying to diagnose something. That's a lot of what the early stages of decision making is like, what kind of thing is this? What does this most
Mm-hmm.
closely match onto? And then look deeper into that. Is it a match or not? Then move to the next thing. So I think that's another reason why history is so important and why the examples you've collected are so important, is because until you have a certain kind of a minimum viable collection of these things, then you're just not going to be able to quickly in the moment pick up the relevance of these things and actually use it. And in a lot of situations, and really, I find that the higher up you go, the more difficult and ambiguous the decisions become, and the less there's going to be any easy answers. And so the more you have to think analogically and draw from history and draw from other examples. Have you had that experience, or have you found patterns like that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's some of life is starting to get really repetitive, and I take that as a good sign, but when I see things happening on whatever the news, which I try to avoid, but it's there, And then I'll have people say to me, like, it wasn't like this before. And I'm like, actually, let me tell you, this has happened about 20 times in the last 2000 years. And so you start to see those patterns and you're like, okay, so like, what does this mean? Is this something we're always going to do? Are there ways to correct this? Are there ways to channel it? How do you navigate this? It also helps to know what to let go of, right? It also helps to see like what is chatter. We do this really fun game in my house where we look at headlines from newspapers that are really old. And I show my kids that like you change a couple words and the headlines are really, really similar. So I do think patterns, and the more you read history, the more you see patterns. Also, the more you learn models, the more you see them everywhere, which is like kind of the fun thing about them. So, I'm at the point where like no matter what I read, I'm like, oh yeah, there's mapping out the territory. Oh, there's feedback loops. Oh, incentives. And then you start to put these really great files of information in your brain that say, okay, like this is the full scope of this model. This is what it means. These are the areas it crops up in. And then when you're in your life, you're like, oh yeah, this situation, this is, there's a few flags being triggered here. I'm familiar with this. I have some ideas right away on how to start navigating this situation.
So I have one quick question, then I want to ask you about the course and kind of the methodology component.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious how you pass on historical knowledge to your kids and how you get them interested in it. Because for me, it was something that only fairly recently it kind of clicked. And I wish somebody had kind of tapped me on the shoulder at an earlier age and said, hey, this is really important. Here's why. So could you talk about that a little bit?
I try to connect with things that I know they find interesting in life. And for kids, it's kind of the weird, key, interesting, outlandish, can you believe this? Whatever they're interested in. My younger son is really into zombies, so like, how can I relate this to what he's concerned about today? But it does stick. I think the other thing too is that when you're excited, I mean, in life in general, when you're excited about something, people share that excitement. So I'll come to the table at dinner and I'll be really excited about this book I read. And like, can you believe this? And I'm not going to say it clicks every time. I mean, sometimes my kids' eyes glaze over,
Yeah.
but they're exposed to me every single day. So even if 20 times a year they find one of my stories interesting, well, after a few years, they have a pretty good historical
Yeah.
repertoire to start seeing things in.
Yeah.
And it's interesting the things that click. My older son is all of a sudden fascinated with the Habsburgs because I told him about how they just inbred for so many years that eventually they couldn't have children anymore because their bodies couldn't function that way. And he
Yeah.
was like, that is incredible. So he went and got his own book on it, just out of curiosity. So, you never know what clicks. I feel with kids in history, it's kind of like, just throw things out there and see what sticks and also encourage things that they're interested in.
Yeah.
So if they're interested in zombies, don't say, well, zombies aren't real or that's not an important topic. It's like, okay.
So what did you
I
say?
mean,
How did you like uh, take the zombie thing and move it to something else? Did you like connect it to history or what did
yeah.
you do
So,
with
well,
it?
we talk about the idea of the undead, like what does that mean? And I'm trying to think, I'm having a moment here where we were just exposed to something and my younger son was like, oh, they're like zombies. But
Mhm.
for the life of me now, I can't remember what it was, but it was some real thing. Oh, I think it was on a nature show.
Mhm.
There's like a bug that somehow like ate another bug's brain and it
Oh
takes
yeah.
possession of it or something. And he's like, it's like a zombie. And I'm like, yes, it is like a zombie. So and he's only 7. So to make those connections is a lot of fun.
Daniel Dennett actually, that's one of his favorite stories. Is there's like a bacteria that gets into the ants. I think it's the ant's brain. Then it climbs up the uh, grass leaf or petal or whatever, and then it gets eaten by a bug or like a something else, and then that gets into the butterfly or whatever. So there's a
Right.
whole like, and I think the bacteria is called a fluke. So there's like a double meaning there. But yeah, so I really like that, and that's what I found as well is like I'll hear something in the news or I'll hear something in conversation, Google it, go to the Wikipedia, scroll down. Eventually, there'll be the historical section. There'll be links to something else, and then I just kind of explore that. And I find that kind of over time, it really brings everything together. And I think history in general, it does allow you to take the disparate ideas and bring them together. So let's finish off with, can you talk a bit about the value that the course specifically brings? Because this isn't, like you said, it isn't just making videos out of what's in the book. It's really about the next step is integrating them. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So it really is about learning how to integrate mental models into your thinking. And full stop, it's great for learning anything, not just mental models. Because a lot of the principles, like we're a principles, not tactics kind of company, right? I mean, the principles are what are going to help you more often in life than specific tactics.
Yeah.
So the course is designed to be principle based. So it talks a lot about, preparing, using reflection. Like what reflection is such an important part of learning. It goes back to that feedback loop, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
how do you make a change? How do you iterate to try something new? You reflect, like you talked about Ray Dalio looking through his old investment decisions. That's super important. It's super important to keep a record of big decisions,
Mm-hmm.
even medium sized ones, how you made them, what your expectations were going in versus what happened, why. That's how you learn. That's how you iterate and try again. So the course it uses those sort of foundational concepts and then puts them in the specific context of learning mental models. So specific ideas on where to try models, how to try them, how often to try them, how to reflect on them, how to keep building them. We talk about obstacles that we've faced that other people have brought to us, how we've overcome them.
Mm-hmm.
So it really is to give you a toolkit, not just models themselves, but this amazing toolkit. So that, like I always say, I'm at the point now with mental models that there's a whole bunch of scary stuff in life, but I'm never frozen. I never come across something where I'm like, oh my gosh, I have no idea what to do, because now I have this toolkit. And so that's what we're trying to give everybody else, is the means of building this toolkit so that no matter what life throws at you, it may not always go great. You may not always have all the answers, but at least you have a way to start,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is a lot of people, don't have.
Yeah, I've found the same thing. It's very powerful to always have a place to start and always have something to get that initial fire started and then build from there. So thanks a lot for coming on. I recommend everybody check out the Farnam Street blog. It's one of the best sites for mental models anywhere online. Popular, and also check out the great uh, mental models book series and the new mental models course. And I'll have links to everything down in the description. So thanks again for coming on, and I look forward to talking again.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun.